The ward is quiet. Too quiet. Fluorescent lights hum over sleeping patients. A clock reads 2:47 a.m. Then the doors burst open. A masked man steps in, gun raised, breathing hard. Alarms haven't triggered yet. He moved too fast, too clean. Nurses freeze. A tray of instruments clatters to the floor. Somewhere, a patient's monitor beeps faster, matching the fear in the room. In the corner, a nurse stands still, mid-30s, tired eyes, the kind of face nobody remembers after a shift change. Her badge reads Nurse, Night Shift. She has been called slow before. Forgettable, careful to the point of being overlooked. The gunman scans the room, shouting for everyone to get down. Everyone drops, except her. She lowers herself slowly, calmly, like she's done this before. Not out of fear, out of calculation. Her hand brushes the edge of a supply cart. Her eyes track his stance, his grip, the half second his finger hesitates on the trigger. Nobody in that ward knows who she really is. Not yet, because in 3 minutes, this gunman is going to make the worst mistake of his life. And the last people to believe her are about to owe her theirs. The hospital breathed the way it always did after midnight, slow, mechanical, indifferent. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine hummed. A cartwheel squeaked against linoleum. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale, sterile glow over the 10th floor ward. Nurse Elena Cho moved through it like she belonged to the silence. She was 36, average height, unremarkable in every way the hospital's culture seemed to value. She didn't laugh loudly at the nurse's station. She didn't complain about 12-hour shifts or a stipend that never quite covered rent. She simply worked, checked vitals, adjusted for drips, logged charts and handwriting, so neat it looked printed. Cho, table 6 needs a refill, said Marcus, one of the younger nurses, not looking up from his phone. On it, she said, already walking. Nobody thanked her. Nobody needed to. She wasn't the kind of person who required acknowledgement to keep moving. That was, in itself, unusual, but nobody in that ward had the eyes to see it. She reached the supply room, retrieved a saline bag, checked the expiration date out of habit rather than doubt, and returned to room 12, where an elderly man named Mr. Alvarez lay half asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. "You're back," he murmured, eyes fluttering open. "Always," she said, adjusting the 4-line with practiced precision. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Not during long shifts, not during code blues, not during the chaos of trauma nights when doctors shouted over each other and interns froze at the sight of blood. 3 months ago, during a multi-car pileup that flooded the ER with 12 critical patients in under an hour, Elena had triaged 4 of them single-handedly before backup arrived. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't hesitated. She'd simply moved from bed to bed, calling out vitals in a voice so calm that Dr. Whitfield, the attending physician, had paused mid-stitch to look at her. "You've done this before," he'd said. Not a question, an observation. "Everyone's done triage training," she'd replied, and turned back to her patient. He hadn't pushed further. Nobody ever did. There was something about the way she deflected, smooth, immediate, final, that discouraged follow-up questions. People assumed what was easiest to assume, that she was simply good at her job. Competent. Nothing more. It was easier that way. At 1:15 a.m., she took her break in the staff lounge, a cramped room with 2 vending machines and a coffee pot that had seen better decades. Sarah, a newer nurse, sat across from her, scrolling through her phone with the specific exhaustion of someone 6 months into their first hospital job. "How do you do it?" Sarah asked suddenly. Elena glanced up from her lukewarm coffee. "Do what?" "Stay so calm. Every time something goes wrong, you're just—" Sarah made a flat gesture with her hand. "Steady. Like nothing surprises you." Elena considered the question longer than it seemed to deserve. "I don't like surprises," she said finally. "So I try to see them coming before they happen." Sarah laughed, assuming it was a joke. Elena didn't correct her. The truth was heavier than the lounge could hold at 1 a.m., and Elena had long since learned which truths were worth the weight of explaining and which were better left folded away, tucked beneath the ordinary rhythm of charts and vitals and refilled saline bags. 9 years ago, in a different life, in a different uniform, she had learned to read rooms the way most people read headlines. Fast, instinctively, cataloging exits and threats and the particular stillness that came before violence. She had learned to move through chaos without becoming part of it. She had learned that calm wasn't the absence of fear. It was the discipline of not letting fear choose your next move. None of that belonged in a hospital break room. None of it belonged anywhere near the quiet, careful life she had built here, where the biggest emergency was usually a missed dosage or a patient pulling out their own for. She liked it that way. She had chosen it that way. Back on the floor, the ward settled into its familiar late-night rhythm. Monitors beeped in overlapping patterns, a soft chorus of steady heartbeats. Dr. Whitfield passed her in the hallway, nodding once, the kind of nod exchange between two people who trusted each other's competence without needing to discuss it. "Quiet night," he said. "For now," she replied, and something in her tone made him glance back at her. Just for a second, just long enough to register that she hadn't meant it as a hopeful statement. She'd meant it as an observation. He didn't ask what she meant. He rarely did. There was a version of Elena Cho that existed only in flashes, in the two quick reflexes when a tray fell, in the way she always positioned herself near the door in any room, in the 3 seconds of stillness before she moved during any emergency, as though she were running calculations no one else could see. Most people didn't notice these things. Most people weren't looking. At the nurse's station, Marcus was complaining about a delayed shipment of supplies. "They said Tuesday. It's Thursday. Nothing works around here." "It'll come," Elena said, without looking up from the chart she was updating. "How do you know?" "I don't. I just don't waste energy being angry about things I can't control." Marcus rolled his eyes, unconvinced, and went back to his phone. He didn't notice. Nobody noticed. The way Elena's gaze flicked toward the ward in trance every few minutes, an old habit dressed up as idle observation. She wasn't watching for supply deliveries. She was watching because watching had once been her job, and some habits didn't retire just because the uniform did. At 2:30 a.m., Room 9's patient monitor let out a soft alarm. A minor irregularity, nothing urgent. Elena was there within seconds, silencing the alert, checking the leads, murmuring reassurance to the half-conscious patient before the sound had even fully registered with anyone else on the floor. "False alarm," she called out, already resetting the monitor. Sarah appeared in the doorway, breathless from rushing. "You beat me here. I was closer." "You're always closer," Sarah said, only half joking. Elena offered a small, tired smile, the kind meant to end a conversation, not continue it, and moved on to her next round. She didn't know, not yet, that in 17 minutes, the ward's stillness would break apart entirely. She didn't know that the quiet competence she'd spent years disguising as ordinary nursing skill was about to become the only thing standing between a masked man and a room full of people who had no idea how to survive what was coming. She only knew, as she always did in the hours before something went wrong, that the air had changed. Not much, just enough. Enough that when she passed the ward's east doors on her way to the medication room, she paused, just for a second, and glanced down the empty corridor toward the elevator bank. Nothing there. Not yet. She kept walking, telling herself it was nothing. But some part of her, the part that never fully left her old life behind, was already counting exits. The medication room was narrow, lined with locked cabinets and a computer terminal that always ran 3 seconds slower than it should. Elena scanned her badge, entered her code, and began pulling the night's second round of medications. Insulin for room 14, antibiotics for room 7, a mild sedative for room 3, where an anxious post-op patient kept ringing for reassurance he didn't medically need. It was routine. It was supposed to be routine. That was when she noticed the visitor log. A clipboard sat by the ward's side entrance, the one rarely used except by staff taking shortcuts to the parking structure. Visiting hours had ended at 9. The log showed only 2 entries after that. A chaplain at 9:40 p.m., signed out at 10:15, and a name at 11:52 p.m. that made her pause. D. Reyes, visiting room 14. Room 14 belonged to a 78-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery. Elena had checked on her twice that night. No family had visited. No family had called. The woman had mentioned, almost apologetically, that her only son lived in another state and couldn't make the trip. Elena looked at the name again. D. Reyes. No timestamp for sign out. She could have dismissed it. Visitor logs were sloppy things, half filled by exhausted security guards, half ignored by staff who assumed someone else was watching. But dismissing things without checking them was a habit she'd trained herself out of a long time ago, in a different life, where a dismissed detail could cost more than an awkward conversation. She walked to the security desk near the main entrance, where Ray, the overnight guard, sat half watching four muted monitors and half scrolling through something on his own phone. "Hey Ray, you remember someone signing in for room 14 around midnight? Name's Reyes." Ray squinted at the monitors, unhurried. "Didn't come through the front. Only door I'm watching. There's a side entrance log with his name on it. That door's supposed to be staff only after 9. Probably someone let a family member slip through. Happens." He shrugged, already losing interest. "You want me to check the camera?" "Please." He rewound the side entrance feed with visible reluctance, the kind reserved for tasks that interrupted a slow night. The grainy footage showed a man in a gray jacket entering at 11:51 p.m., face angled away from the camera the entire time. Not obviously, not suspiciously, just consistently, as though he knew exactly where the lens was and had planned his entry accordingly. "There," Ray said. "See? Nothing weird. Guy visits his grandma. Doesn't want to deal with front desk paperwork at midnight. People do that." Elena watched the man walk with unhurried steps toward the elevator, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way that looked practiced rather than natural. Most nervous late-night visitors moved quickly, apologetically, aware they were somewhere they technically shouldn't be. This man moved like someone comfortable being unseen. "Can you pull up when he left?" Ray sighed but scrubbed forward. The feed showed nothing. No exit through that door for the rest of the night. "Maybe he left through the front," Ray offered. "Did he?" Ray checked the other feed, already looking bored. "Nope. Doesn't show up. So he's still in the building. Or he left through the stairwell exit, which doesn't have a camera because budget cuts are apparently more important than security," Ray said, with the flat sarcasm of someone who'd filed the complaint before and been ignored. "Look, I'll note it in the log. If it's nothing, it's nothing." Elena didn't argue. Arguing rarely changed anything with tired security guards at 1 a.m., and she had 6 patients waiting on medication. But she filed the detail away in the same mental drawer where she kept every small inconsistency worth remembering. A drawer that had, in her old life, occasionally saved lives. She checked on Mrs. Alvarez in room 14 a few minutes later. The old woman was asleep, her breathing even, the hospital room undisturbed. No sign of any visitor. No flowers, no note, nothing to suggest a grandson named Reyes had come and gone in the night. Elena stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, scanning the room the way she used to scan rooms before entering them fully. Checking the window, checking the bathroom door, checking the small closet where personal belongings were kept. Nothing out of place. Still, something about the visitor log gnawed at her. Not fear, exactly, more like the itch of an equation that hadn't fully solved itself yet. She'd learned to trust that itch. It had rarely been wrong. At 2:10 a.m., her phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number, forwarded through the hospital's main switchboard, which meant someone had specifically asked to be connected to the 10th floor nurses' station. 10th floor, this is Elena. Silence on the other end. Not dead air. The kind of silence that came from someone listening, breathing, deciding whether to speak. "Hello," she said again. The call ended. No voice. No message. She looked at the receiver for a second longer than she needed to, then set it down, glancing toward Marcus, who hadn't looked up from restocking supplies. "Anyone call in the last few minutes asking about a patient?" "Not that I heard." "Why?" "No reason." She said it lightly, but her eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward the ward's main doors. Old instincts didn't announce themselves loudly. They surfaced as small frictions, a call with no voice, a visitor with no exit, a feeling that the ward's usual rhythm had shifted by some fraction too small to name, but too specific to ignore. She found Dr. Whitfield near the nurse's station, reviewing a chart. "Can I ask you something?" Always. Room 14, Mrs. Alvarez. Any reason someone named Reyes would be listed as a late-night visitor? Whitfield frowned, flipping briefly through the chart in his hands, though he clearly already knew the answer wasn't there. Not that I'm aware. Why? Security logged someone by that name coming through the side entrance around midnight. He never signed out. Camera doesn't show him leaving. Whitfield's frown deepened, the tired amusement of a long shift giving way to something more careful. You think it's a problem? I think it's worth someone checking before it becomes one. He studied her for a beat, the particular look of a man recalculating his estimate of someone he thought he already understood. You want me to call hospital security supervisor about it? It wouldn't hurt. All right. He made a note, unhurried but not dismissive. You got good instincts, Cho. You know that. I just don't like loose threads, she said, already turning back toward her rounds. What she didn't say, what she had no intention of ever saying, not in this hallway, not in this life, was that loose threads had once been her specialty, that she had spent years learning to notice the details other people trained themselves to overlook, because overlooking the wrong detail in her old world hadn't just meant embarrassment or inconvenience. It had meant funerals. By 2:35 a.m., the hospital security supervisor had reviewed the footage, shrugged at the ambiguity, and promised to keep an eye on it, the professional equivalent of filing something away to be forgotten. Ray returned to his monitors. Marcus returned to his complaints about the supply shipment. Sarah returned to her rounds, humming faintly to stay awake. The ward settled back into its rhythm, but the itch in Elena's mind didn't fade. She moved through her remaining rounds with the same calm efficiency as always, checking vitals, adjusting medications, reassuring anxious patients. But some part of her stayed alert in a way the rest of the staff wouldn't have recognized even if they'd been looking directly at her. She didn't know yet what the visitor log meant, or whether the silent phone call was connected, or whether any of it mattered at all. She only knew the particular, unwelcome clarity of a feeling she hadn't felt in 9 years. Not since she'd traded tactical vests for scrubs and command decisions for medication charts. The feeling of a situation that hadn't fully declared itself yet, but was already moving. At 2:44 a.m., the ward's stairwell door, the one without a camera, opened without triggering any alarm at all. At 2:47 a.m., the ward's east door swung open with a bang that didn't belong to any sound the night shift was used to. Elena was 3 steps from the medication room when she heard it. Not the soft whoosh of the automatic doors, but a hard, deliberate shove, metal against metal, followed by fast footsteps on linoleum. Her body reacted before her mind finished processing why. She turned. A man stood in the corridor, mid-height, build hidden under a dark jacket, a ski mask pulled low over his face, a pistol held low but ready in his right hand. Not waving it around for show, not shouting yet, just moving with the focused urgency of someone who had rehearsed this. That detail registered instantly, cataloged and filed before Elena had even taken her next breath. He's done this before, or trained for it. Everybody down. Now. Down. His voice cracked with adrenaline, but carried an edge of control. He wasn't panicking. He was executing. The ward dissolved into chaos in the space of 2 heartbeats. A meal cart clattered sideways as an aide scrambled back from it. Sarah, 3 doors down, froze mid-step, a tray of supplies slipping from her hands and shattering against the floor. Somewhere behind the nurse's station, Marcus's chair rolled backward as he half fell out of it, hands rising instinctively. Get down. Get down now. The gunman shouted again, sweeping the pistol across the room in a wide arc that made 2 visiting family members near room 11 drop instantly to the floor, one of them crying out. Elena lowered herself. Not out of panic, out of calculation. She dropped to one knee, then fully to the floor, hands visible, posture submissive, every outward signal a frightened nurse should give. But underneath that surface compliance, something else had already switched on, an old machinery she hadn't used in 9 years but had never actually forgotten how to run. Assess. Don't react. Assess. 1 shooter, visible. Handgun, a Glock variant. From the silhouette, magazine capacity roughly 15 to 17 rounds. No visible backup weapon. No obvious secondary threat yet. though the visitor log from hours earlier surfaced immediately in her mind. D. Reyes. Side entrance. No exit recorded. This wasn't random. He'd been inside the building for nearly 3 hours before making his move. He waited. He's not just angry. He's here for something specific. Where is she? The gunman demanded, voice raised but not aimless. His eyes, the only visible part of his face, scanned room numbers stenciled on the walls. Room 14. Where's room 14? The words hit Elena like cold water. Mrs. Alvarez, the 78-year-old widow with a fractured hip. No family visits. No enemies. No reason for anyone to storm a hospital ward armed and masked, demanding her room number. Unless the visitor from midnight hadn't come to see her at all. Unless he'd come to confirm exactly where she was for someone who intended to come back. This isn't about a patient. It's about who else is connected to her. Or what she knows. Or who she is. Elena didn't have the full picture yet. She didn't need it yet. She needed information, and information came from watching, not guessing. I said, where is room 14? The gunman's voice cracked louder. More dangerous. Aimed now at Marcus, who was closest to the nurse's station computer. D down the hall? Marcus stammered, pointing with a shaking hand. Left side. Third door. Good. Buy time. Don't be a hero. Not yet. The gunman's head snapped toward the direction Marcus indicated, and for a fraction of a second his attention split. Half on the room he wanted, half on the terrified staff scattered across the floor around him. That fraction of a second was the kind of gap Elena had once been trained to notice and exploit without hesitation. But she didn't move. Not yet. There was a difference between an opportunity and a good opportunity, and rushing the wrong one got people killed. She'd learned that lesson early, learned it hard, learned it in places that didn't offer second chances for impatience. Watch. Wait. Let him commit to a direction. Nobody moves. The gunman barked, backing toward the hallway that led to room 14, while keeping the pistol trained generally across the room. Anybody touches a phone, anybody makes a sound, I start with the old lady. A woman near room 11 sobbed quietly. Sarah, still frozen by the shattered supply tray, had tears streaking silently down her face, her hands pressed flat against the floor as though holding herself down by force. Elena caught Sarah's eyes for half a second. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply held the younger nurse's gaze with a steadiness that said, without words, "Don't move. Don't panic. Just breathe." It was a small thing, almost nothing, but Sarah's shoulders dropped a fraction, her breathing slowing by some tiny, crucial degree. Small anchors matter. Panic spreads faster than gunfire in rooms like this. The gunman began moving down the hallway toward room 14, pistol still raised, glancing backward every few steps to ensure no one on the floor was rising behind him. He was cautious, trained, or at least drilled enough to know that turning your back fully on a room of hostages was how people got overpowered in movies, and more relevantly in reality. He's not an amateur, but he's alone. That's something. Elena's mind ran through the ward's layout with the automatic precision of muscle memory that had never fully faded, no matter how many years of scrubs and clipboards she'd layered over it. Nurse's station. 1 exit north, 1 south. Medication room. Locked, reinforced door, no direct line of sight to room 14. Supply closet near room 9. Contains nothing useful beyond gauze and cleaning supplies, but positioned with a clear sight line down the hallway the gunman had just entered. If this escalates, that hallway is the bottleneck. Whoever controls that hallway controls the ward. She didn't move yet. Moving now, with the gunman's back only partially turned and his pistol still capable of swinging toward the room in half a second, would be reckless. The kind of instinct that got civilians killed in situations exactly like this one. Elena wasn't interested in being a hero. She was interested in everyone in this ward surviving the next 10 minutes, and heroics without calculation rarely accomplish that. Let him reach the room. Let him get committed to whatever he thinks he's doing there. Then reassess. From down the hall, Mrs. Alvarez's frightened voice carried faintly through her partially open door. Please, please, I don't understand what you... Shut up, the gunman snapped, his voice sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like fear beneath the aggression. That detail mattered too. Fear made people unpredictable. Fear made trained men make untrained mistakes. He's not fully in control either. Good. That's leverage, eventually. Elena's eyes flicked toward the nurse's station, where the phone sat untouched on its cradle, and toward Marcus, still frozen on the floor a few feet from it. If someone could reach it silently and dial for help without drawing attention. Not yet. Too risky. He'd hear it. Wait. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, easing herself into a position that looked identical to the frightened crouch of everyone else around her, but was in fact subtly different, weight balanced on the balls of her feet rather than her knees, hands positioned to push off quickly rather than simply braced against the floor. To anyone glancing at her, she looked exactly like a terrified nurse curled defensively on linoleum. She was in truth coiled. From room 14, the gunman's voice rose again, more urgent now, almost desperate. Where is it? Where did you put it? He's not just here for her. He's here for something she has, or something he thinks she has. Elena's mind cycled rapidly through possibilities. Hidden money, a piece of evidence, information tied to whatever life Mrs. Alvarez had lived before becoming an elderly hip surgery patient nobody thought twice about. The specifics didn't matter yet. What mattered was the shape of the situation forming in her mind. An armed man, alone, driven by urgency rather than pure malice, searching for something specific in a room he believed was undefended. He didn't know the room, and the entire floor held someone who wasn't undefended at all. The sound of a drawer being yanked open echoed down the hallway, followed by Mrs. Alvarez's frightened cry. Not pain, Elena registered immediately, just fear, still just fear, and something crashing to the floor. Windows closing. He's getting more agitated the longer he doesn't find what he wants. Elena's gaze moved once more across the room. Sarah still trembling but steady enough now to hold still. Marcus, pale but silent. The two family members near room 11, huddled together. The phone at the nurse's station, still within reach if someone moved carefully enough. And the supply closet near room 9, its doors slightly ajar, offering a narrow but clear line toward the hallway the gunman occupied. She didn't have a plan yet, not a full one, but she had the beginning of one, forming with the same cold clarity that had once guided her through corridors far more dangerous than this. Corridors where the stakes were measured in lives lost per second of hesitation, not headlines. First, contain the information. Nobody here can know what I actually am. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Second, buy time. Every minute he spends searching that room instead of controlling this one is a minute I can use. Third, control the exits before he realizes there's anything to control. She began, slowly, silently, to move. Elena moved the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, never announcing itself until it had already arrived somewhere new. She shifted her weight forward onto her palms, then eased herself up into a low crouch, staying below the sightline of the hallway where the gunman was still tearing through room 14's belongings. From the room, his voice carried in fragments, frustrated, sharp, punctuated by the sound of drawers slamming and fabric tearing. Where is it? You people don't just lose things. Mrs. Alvarez's voice, thin and frightened, answered something too quiet to make out. Elena used the cover of that exchange to close the 4 feet between herself and Marcus, who lay frozen near the nurse's station, his eyes wide and fixed on the hallway. Marcus, she whispered, barely more than breath. Look at me, not the hallway. Me. His eyes snapped to hers, glassy with adrenaline. You're going to reach up, very slowly, and press the silent panic button under the desk. Not the phone. The button. Do you know where it is? He nodded, throat working. Good. Don't dial anything. Don't make a sound. Just the button. Can you do that? Another nod, more certain this time. Fear responded well to specific instructions. Elena had learned that lesson in places far worse than this hallway, where panicking soldiers became useful the moment someone gave them one clear, small task to focus on instead of the larger, unbearable picture. Marcus began inching toward the desk's underside, movements small and controlled, his breathing audible but quiet enough not to travel. Elena kept her eyes on the hallway entrance, watching for any shift in the shadow that would indicate the gunman turning back toward the main ward. Nothing yet. He was still occupied, still tearing through room 14, his urgency working in her favor for now. Every second he spends in that room is a second I can use. She glanced toward Sarah, who had stopped shaking quite so visibly, though her face remained pale, her eyes darting toward Elena with silent, desperate questions. Elena gave her the smallest possible shake of the head. Stay still, stay quiet, and Sarah obeyed, pressing herself flatter against the floor. Marcus's fingers found the panic button beneath the desk. Elena saw the tension in his shoulders release fractionally as he pressed it. A silent alert that would now be crawling through the hospital's security system, alerting the front desk, and, depending on protocol, local police. It wouldn't bring help in seconds. Realistically, it would bring help in minutes. Minutes she still needed to survive. Good. That buys eventual backup. Now I need to buy the time between now and then. From room 14, the gunman's voice rose sharply. I know you have it. Everett said you'd have it, Everett. The name registered in Elena's memory instantly, filed away without her fully understanding yet why it mattered. Only that it did. A name meant something was organized, planned, connected to people beyond this one masked man in this one hallway. She used the cover of his rising volume to move again, this time toward the supply closet near room 9, staying low, staying silent, her bare feet. She'd kicked off her clogs somewhere in the initial chaos without consciously deciding to, making no sound against the linoleum. The closet door was ajar, exactly as she remembered it. Inside, shelves of gauze, saline bags, a crash cart partially stocked, cleaning supplies, and, tucked in the back corner, forgotten by everyone except the maintenance staff who occasionally complained about it, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, red and heavy and utterly unremarkable. Elena's mind ran through the object's weight, its potential use, the mechanics of its handle and pin, with the same detached clarity she might have once applied to assessing a weapon in a very different context. A fire extinguisher wasn't a weapon. It was, however, a tool. Heavy enough to disorient, blunt enough to disable without necessarily escalating into something lethal. And, crucially, something a timid nurse might grab in blind panic without raising suspicion about her competence. Restraint. Not force. Not yet. Force is what he expects. Force is what gives away everything. She left the extinguisher where it was. Not yet, not until the moment called for it. And instead reached for something smaller, a roll of medical tape, thick and durable, the kind used to secure heavy bandaging after major surgery. She tucked it into the waistband of her scrub pants, out of sight, and grabbed a pair of surgical scissors from the same shelf, sliding them into her sleeve with a motion so practiced it barely registered as motion at all. Not weapons. Tools. There's a difference, and it matters. For now. From room 14, the sound of a struggle briefly rose. Mrs. Alvarez's voice cracking into a cry, the gunman's voice snapping something harsh in response. And Elena's entire body went taut with the specific, controlled tension of someone calculating exactly how many seconds remained before restraint stopped being an option. Not yet. If he hurts her badly, I move immediately. Until then, I wait for the better opening. She eased back out of the supply closet, retracing her path toward the main cluster of hostages, positioning herself now slightly closer to the hallway entrance than before. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention if the gunman emerged suddenly, but close enough that the 4 or 5 steps between her and that entrance had become 3. Positioning matters more than speed. Speed without positioning just gets you shot. Sarah's eyes found hers again, wide and questioning. Elena held her gaze for half a second, then deliberately looked toward the ward's south exit. A silent instruction, as clear as she could make it without words. If this breaks bad, that's where you run. Sarah's chin dipped, almost imperceptibly. She understood, or understood enough. The hallway fell into an uneasy quiet. The gunman's voice had dropped to something lower, more controlled. An exchange with Mrs. Alvarez that Elena couldn't fully make out, but that carried a different quality now. Less rage, more negotiation. He needs something from her. Alive. That's useful. That means he's not planning to hurt her unless he has to. That single piece of information reshaped the entire calculation in Elena's mind. A gunman who needed his hostage cooperative and unharmed was a gunman operating under constraints. Constraints Elena could work with, manipulate, exploit if she moved carefully enough. A gunman who'd already decided violence was inevitable was an entirely different, far more dangerous problem. He's not there yet. Keep him from getting there. She glanced toward the nurse's station, where the desk phone sat within Marcus's reach now that the panic button had been pressed. Calling directly would be reckless. The gunman would hear a dial tone, hear a voice, and any element of unpredictability would evaporate into pure threat response. But the panic button had already done its job. Somewhere in the building, security was moving. The question wasn't whether help was coming. The question was whether the ward would still be a survivable situation by the time it arrived. From room 14, the gunman's voice rose again, sharper, more desperate. The account. I need the account information. Everett said you managed it for him. The transfers, all of it. Where's the documentation? Financial. This is about money. Fraud, embezzlement, something laundered through an old woman nobody would suspect. That's why nobody's ever visited her. That's why the grandson scouted the room first. The picture sharpened rapidly in Elena's mind, the specific mechanics of it mattering less than the shape it revealed. This wasn't random violence. This was a targeted extraction, poorly executed by someone under pressure from people more dangerous than himself. Which meant, somewhere beyond this hospital ward, there was an Everett who had sent this man, and consequences waiting for him if he failed. Cornered men make desperate choices. He's not just dangerous. He's running out of options. That makes him unpredictable in a different way than before. Mrs. Alvarez's voice, thin but suddenly firmer, carried down the hallway. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm 78 years old. I had a hip replacement. I don't manage anyone's accounts. A pause. Then the gunman's voice, low and dangerous. Don't lie to me. Everett said, Everett is dead. Mrs. Alvarez snapped with a sudden, brittle clarity that cut through the tension in the hallway like a blade. He's been dead for 3 months. Whatever he told you before he died, it's not here. It never was. Silence. Elena felt the shift in the air before she understood it fully. The particular, dangerous quiet of a plan collapsing in real time. Of a man realizing the entire premise of his mission had been built on information that no longer held true. This is the moment. This is where it either de-escalates or gets much worse. You're lying, the gunman said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction, replaced by something closer to panic. You have to be lying. Elena's hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward the surgical scissors tucked in her sleeve. Not drawing them, not yet, just confirming their position, the way a person double-checks a door is locked before deciding whether to leave the house. If he comes out of that room angry and empty-handed, someone in this ward is going to absorb that anger. I need to be the one closest to him when that happens. Not Sarah, not Marcus, me. She began with the smallest possible movements to shift her position again. Closer to the hallway, closer to the exact spot where the gunman would emerge if his search continued to fail, positioning herself not as a target, but as the first and most convenient obstacle between his frustration and everyone else's safety. It wasn't heroism. She would have rejected that word entirely if anyone had offered it to her in that moment. It was arithmetic, cold, familiar, necessary arithmetic she had performed in far worse rooms than this one, long before she'd ever learned to hold a saline bag or read a chart. Position, timing, restraint until restraint stops being useful. From room 14, a chair scraped violently against the floor. He was coming out. The gunman emerged from room 14 with nothing in his hands and everything in his posture that told Elena the situation had just become more dangerous, not less. His shoulders were rigid. His pistol, which had drifted downward during his search, snapped back up to a ready position the moment he cleared the doorway. Behind him, Mrs. Alvarez's voice called out something pleading, ignored entirely now that he'd apparently decided she had nothing left to offer him. Nobody moves, he said again, though his voice carried a different texture than before, thinner, more frayed, a man realizing his plan had failed and searching for whatever leverage remained. Elena remained still, positioned now roughly 8 feet from the hallway entrance, close enough to react quickly, far enough to avoid appearing deliberately positioned. Her eyes tracked him without appearing to track him. A skill drilled into her so many years ago that it no longer required conscious effort, only conscious restraint from acting on everything it told her. His breathing's faster, grips tighter on the pistol. He's recalculating, and recalculating men make mistakes or make things worse. I don't know which yet. Somebody's phone, he said suddenly, scanning the room. Somebody call someone. Whose phone is on that desk? Marcus, still crouched near the nurse's station, froze as the gunman's attention swung directly toward him. It's just the hospital line, Marcus stammered. Nobody called anyone. Then why's the light on it different? The panic button. He noticed the indicator light change. Elena's mind raced through the layout of the desk, the visible indicators, the split-second calculation of what the gunman could and couldn't actually determine from across the room. He wasn't hospital staff. He likely didn't know what a silent alarm indicator looked like versus a normal call light. But his suspicion alone was dangerous enough, regardless of whether his read was accurate. Redirect. Now. That's the call light for room 9, Elena said, her voice pitched exactly the way a frightened nurse's voice should sound. Slightly higher than normal, slightly unsteady, but clear enough to be understood. Patient's on a cardiac monitor. It blinks when his heart rate changes. It does that every few minutes. It's not connected to anything outside this floor. The gunman's eyes shifted to her. The first time he'd directly focused on her since bursting through the doors, and Elena felt the full weight of his attention land on her like a physical thing. She kept her posture small, her shoulders hunched, her eyes wide with a fear that wasn't entirely manufactured, because some part of the fear was real. She simply refused to let it be the part that made decisions. You a nurse? Yes. You know this floor? I work this floor. Every night. He studied her for a moment longer, and Elena held perfectly still under that scrutiny, cataloging details even as she endured it. The slight tremor in his gun hand that hadn't been there minutes ago, the sheen of sweat visible at his hairline beneath the mask, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the ward's main doors as though calculating an exit that hadn't been part of his original plan. He's improvising now. The plan died in that room with Mrs. Alvarez's answer. Everything from here forward is him trying to salvage something, money, information, and escape anything. Fine, he said finally, looking away from her, and Elena allowed herself a slow, controlled breath. Fine. New plan. Everybody's phones on the floor now. Slide them toward me. A ripple of compliance moved through the room. Sarah's phone skidding across the linoleum. One of the family members near room 11 tossing hers forward with shaking hands. Marcus sliding his across the desk's edge. Elena didn't move. You too, the gunman said, gesturing toward her with the pistol. Phone. I don't carry mine on shift, she said. Locker room. 3rd floor. It was a lie, delivered with the same flat, unremarkable calm she used when reassuring anxious patients about routine procedures. Her phone was in the front pocket of her scrub top, powered on, silent, exactly where it always was during a shift. But handing it over would mean losing the one tool that could, eventually, become useful. And more importantly, patting her down to verify the lie would require him to get closer to her than he currently was, which was a calculation she wasn't ready to force yet. He didn't press it. Whatever calm authority he'd walked in with had eroded into something closer to barely contained panic. And panic, Elena knew, made men skip steps they would have followed rigorously an hour earlier. Good. Let him believe the smaller lies. Save the bigger ones for when they matter more. Okay, he said, more to himself than to the room, pistol swinging in a slow arc as he tried to reassert control over a situation that had stopped following his script. Okay, new plan. I need a way out of here that isn't the front doors. Loading dock. Where's the loading dock? Nobody answered immediately. Elena watched Marcus's eyes dart toward her, silently deferring, and she understood in that instant that the room had, without any formal decision, begun treating her as the person who knew what to say to keep this from getting worse. They don't know why. They just know I haven't panicked. That's enough for them right now. Basement level, Elena said. You'd need the service elevator. It's past the nurse's station, down that hallway. She tilted her head slightly toward the corridor beyond the desk. Not the actual route to the loading dock, but close enough to be plausible, far enough to buy time and force him through a longer, more exposed path if he chose to trust her. It wasn't lying for the sake of lying. It was redirection with purpose, sending him toward a corridor with more turns, more potential choke points, more opportunities for whatever was coming through those east doors eventually to intercept him before he reached an actual exit. If security or police arrive while he's navigating that hallway, that's better for everyone than him reaching an actual loading dock with hostages in tow. The gunman hesitated, glancing toward the corridor she'd indicated, then back at the room full of hostages, clearly weighing whether taking someone with him as leverage made his odds better or worse. "You," he said, and Elena felt something cold settle into her stomach even as her expression remained carefully unchanged. "You know the building. You're coming with me. There it is." This was the fork she'd been calculating toward without fully admitting it to herself. The moment where staying passive stopped being the safest option for the room and started being the most dangerous one specifically for her. Going with him meant leaving Sarah, Marcus, and the others behind, unguarded, but also removed from his immediate volatility. Refusing meant forcing a confrontation here, now, in a room full of civilians who could easily become collateral if things went wrong. Neither option is good. Pick the one where I control more variables. "Okay," Elena said, rising slowly, hands visible, movements deliberately unhurried. "Okay, I'll show you." She caught Sarah's eyes one last time as she stood, a fraction of a second no more, and gave the smallest possible nod, a signal that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already understand it. "Wait for security. Don't follow. Keep everyone calm until help arrives." Sarah's chin trembled, but she nodded back, understanding enough of it to obey. "Move," the gunman said, gesturing with the pistol toward the corridor, positioning himself half a step behind her. Close enough to control her, far enough that she couldn't easily reach him without him reacting first. It was a textbook hostage escort position, and the recognition of that fact told Elena something important. Whatever training this man had, it wasn't purely improvised panic. Someone had taught him basics, even if fear had eroded most of his composure since. Not just muscle. Someone with actual instruction sent him. That raises the stakes on whoever ever it was, and whoever's still out there expecting a result. They moved together into the corridor, Elena's bare feet silent against the linoleum, the gunman's boots scuffing slightly behind her, his breathing audible, ragged, betraying an exhaustion that adrenaline alone couldn't fully explain. He's been awake for a long time, maybe planning this for days, maybe longer. That fatigue is a resource if I use it right. "Which way?" he demanded as they reached the junction she described. "Left," Elena said, guiding him deeper into the ward's administrative wing. A section with fewer patient rooms, more offices, more doors that could be used strategically, and crucially, a narrow stairwell junction that connected to the same stairs he'd likely used to enter unnoticed hours earlier. If this breaks here, it breaks in a controlled space, away from patients. That's the whole point. As they walked, Elena's mind ran through the tools she carried. The surgical scissors still tucked in her sleeve, the roll of tape at her waistband, the geography of the corridor ahead, every doorway and blind corner cataloged with the same cold precision she'd once applied to far more lethal environments. She wasn't afraid of what came next. She was afraid, in the specific and manageable way she'd trained herself to tolerate, of miscalculating the timing. One chance, maybe two. Make them count. Behind them, faint and distant, the first sound of sirens began threading through the night air outside the building. Still minutes away, still too far to change anything happening in this hallway right now, but close enough that Elena understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, exactly how much time she actually had left to solve this herself before outside help arrived and complicated everything with variables she couldn't control. Not long. Not long at all. The gunman's pistol pressed lightly against her lower back as they turned the next corner. Not fired. Not yet. Just a reminder of the leverage he believed he held completely. He had no idea he was walking deeper into a stairwell junction that Elena had already, 3 turns ago, decided would be exactly where this ended. The stairwell junction was narrower than the main corridors. a concrete landing flanked by a fire door on one side and a service elevator on the other, lit by a single humming fluorescent tube that buzzed unevenly overhead. Elena had chosen this route deliberately, and now, standing in it, she understood exactly why her instincts had pulled her here. It was a bottleneck, a place where movement options narrowed to almost nothing, which meant the next few seconds would decide everything with very little room for error. "This isn't the loading dock," the gunman said, suspicion sharpening his voice as he glanced around the landing. "It's one floor down," Elena said, keeping her voice level. "Service elevator only goes to the basement. You wanted a way out that wasn't the front doors. This is it." He hesitated, pistol still leveled somewhere near her shoulder blades, eyes flicking between the elevator call button and the stairwell door. Elena used the pause to run through the landing's geometry one more time. Distance to the fire door, distance to the elevator, the specific angle at which his gun hand would need to move if he decided, even for a fraction of a second, that he no longer needed her cooperation. Not yet. Let him commit to the elevator. Enclosed spaces favor control, not chaos. That was when the radio clipped to his jacket crackled. Elena hadn't noticed it before. Hidden beneath the collar of his jacket, easy to miss in the chaos of the ward. But now, in the relative quiet of the stairwell, the burst of static was unmistakable, followed by a voice, tinny and urgent. Dom, come in. Cops are staging outside. You need to move now." The gunman's Dom's entire body went rigid. His head snapped toward the radio, then back toward Elena, as though she might somehow be responsible for the message itself. A partner. There's a second person. Outside, watching the building, coordinating. This changed everything, and Elena felt the shift settle into her calculations with the particular, unwelcome weight of a variable she hadn't accounted for. A single gunman, however dangerous, was a contained problem. A gunman coordinating with someone outside, someone watching the police staging, someone capable of adjusting a plan in real time, was an entirely different category of threat. "Dom, you copy?" The voice repeated, sharper now. He fumbled for the radio with his free hand, keeping the pistol trained loosely on Elena as he did. "I copy. I'm here." "She doesn't have it." Reyes was wrong. "She doesn't have anything." A pause, static crackling. Then, "Doesn't matter anymore. Grab whoever's closest and get to the west stairwell. If cops breach, we need something to negotiate with." Elena's pulse didn't spike. She'd trained that reflex out of herself years ago, but something colder and more focused settled into her chest instead. Hostage as negotiation leverage. That's the new plan. And I'm whoever's closest. "Move," Dom said, voice cracking with renewed urgency, gesturing toward the fire door rather than the elevator. "West stairwell. Now." He's not thinking about the loading dock anymore. He's thinking about survival, and I've just become the only asset he has left. This was the moment the calculation shifted from managing a chaotic but limited threat to actively preventing an escalation that could put not just her, but potentially other staff and patients along the west stairwell's route into far greater danger. If police breach teams entered expecting one gunman and encountered a hostage situation with an unknown second party outside coordinating, the odds of a clean resolution dropped considerably. "I can't let him reach that stairwell with me as leverage. Not now." Windows closing. "Move," he repeated, shoving her shoulder with his free hand, pistol pressing harder against her back. Elena stepped forward, toward the fire door he'd indicated, her mind running through the layout of the west stairwell with the same precision she'd applied to every corridor in this building over the last 3 years. A habit she'd never fully explained to herself, until nights like this justified it retroactively. The west stairwell was narrower than this landing, with a single switchback turned roughly 10 feet down. A turn meant a blind corner. A blind corner, for someone escorting a hostage under pressure, was a liability he likely hadn't fully considered in his panic. "There. That's the spot. Wait," she said suddenly, stopping just short of the fire door. "What?" Dom's voice cracked, suspicion and fear tangled together. "If police are staging outside, they'll have this stairwell covered too. It exits near the ambulance bay. That's the first place they'd watch." It wasn't entirely true. She had no confirmed knowledge of police positioning, but it was plausible enough, delivered with enough calm certainty to make him hesitate. "Then where?" he snapped, and Elena heard, beneath the aggression, the unmistakable sound of a man who had run out of his own ideas and was now, however reluctantly, relying on hers. "This is the leverage. Use it. There's a maintenance corridor," she said, nodding toward a nondescript door near the base of the landing, one used almost exclusively by hospital engineering staff and rarely by anyone else. "It runs under the building, connects to the parking structure without passing any of the main exits. Nobody watches it because almost nobody knows it exists." This part was true. She'd noticed it months ago during an unrelated maintenance issue, filed it away the way she filed away every structural detail of every building she spent significant time in, a habit so old it no longer felt like a choice. Dom's eyes narrowed behind the mask, weighing her words against his own fraying sense of control. "You better not be lying. I have no reason to lie. I want this over as much as you do." That, too, was true, though not in the way he likely interpreted it. He gestured toward the maintenance door with the pistol, falling in a step slightly behind her again as she moved toward it, and Elena felt the landing's geometry reorganize itself in her mind as she walked. New angles, new distances, new calculations forming around the specific, narrow darkness of a maintenance corridor that offered far fewer witnesses than the ward above, and, crucially, far fewer risks to anyone but the two of them. This is better. Fewer variables. No civilians. No second gunman close enough to interfere immediately. The maintenance door opened onto a narrow concrete passage lit by intermittent cage bulbs, pipes running along the ceiling, the low hum of building infrastructure replacing the ward's usual chorus of monitors and alarms. Dom hesitated at the threshold, glancing back once toward the stairwell they'd just left, as though some instinct told him this was a mistake even as his desperation pushed him forward anyway. "Keep moving," he said, more to himself than to her. Elena stepped into the corridor, Dom following close behind, the fire doors swinging shut behind them with a heavy, final clunk that sealed off the sound of the world above. Sirens, chaos, the ward's frightened staff, leaving only the two of them, a narrow concrete passage, and the particular silence that Elena recognized, with cold and total clarity, as the moment she had been maneuvering toward since the first crash of the ward's doors nearly 20 minutes earlier. Here. This is where it ends. Not up there, with civilians in the crossfire. Here. She slowed her pace fractionally as they approached the corridor's first turn, the exact blind corner she'd identified from the landing. Her mind already running through the sequence with the detached, practiced clarity of someone who had performed variations of this calculation more times than she would ever admit to anyone in this hospital. Distance to the turn, 6 feet. His attention, split between the radio and the corridor ahead. Grip on the pistol, looser than it was 10 minutes ago. Fatigue, significant. 3 more steps. Dom's radio crackled again, the voice outside issuing something urgent about police movement. And for the fraction of a second his attention split fully toward the sound clipped to his jacket, his pistol hand drifting almost imperceptibly downward as his hand rose instinctively toward the radio instead. Elena had been waiting for exactly that fraction of a second since the moment they'd entered the corridor. She moved. Her hand moved for the pistol, not for him. Years of training had taught her that the weapon was the danger, not the man holding it. Disable the threat, not necessarily the person, if there was any way to manage both. Her fingers closed around his wrist as his hand drifted toward the radio, twisting hard and fast, using his own distracted momentum against him rather than her strength alone. The pistol discharged. The sound in the concrete corridor was enormous, a flat, deafening crack that swallowed every other sense for a fraction of a second, the bullet punching into the ceiling pipe above them in a spray of sparks and dust rather than into either of their bodies. A small mercy, purchased entirely by the fact that Elena's grip had redirected his arm upward at the exact moment his finger tightened. Dom staggered back, more from shock at the noise than any real loss of balance, and Elena used the half-second of his disorientation to drive her elbow into his forearm, forcing the pistol from his weakened grip. It clattered against the concrete floor and skidded several feet away, spinning to a stop near the corridor's far wall. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then Dom lunged, not for the pistol, which was too far now, but for her, a desperate, untrained grab meant to overpower through sheer size and panic rather than any technique. Elena sidestepped, but not cleanly. His shoulder caught her ribs as he crashed past her intended path, and the impact sent a sharp, immediate pain lancing through her side, stealing the breath she needed for her next move. She recovered faster than the pain wanted to let her. Dom scrambled toward the pistol, and Elena forced herself forward despite the protest in her ribs, closing the distance before he could reach it, driving her weight into his back, and using his own forward momentum to send him sprawling past the weapon rather than onto it. He hit the concrete hard, the impact knocking a pained grunt out of him, and for a moment he simply lay there, disoriented, the fight momentarily drained out of him. Elena's hand closed around the pistol. She didn't point it at him immediately. Instead, she stepped back, putting distance between them, her breathing ragged now. Not from exertion alone, but from the pain radiating through her ribs with every inhale, a pain that told her with clinical certainty that something was at minimum badly bruised, possibly fractured. Assess. Contain. Don't escalate further than necessary. Don't move, she said, and her voice, despite everything, remained level, quieter than the corridor's ringing silence demanded, but clear enough to carry the full weight of the command behind it. Dom lifted his head, staring at her with something between confusion and dawning, horrified understanding. Whatever assumption he'd carried about the frightened nurse who'd guided him through these corridors had just collapsed entirely, replaced by a question he didn't yet have the vocabulary to ask. Oh, he started, voice hoarse. Stay down, she said again, cutting him off, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This wasn't the moment for explanations. This was the moment for containment, and containment required clarity, not conversation. The radio on his jacket crackled again, and this time Elena's attention sharpened toward it with immediate, focused urgency. Dom, talk to me. I heard a shot. What's happening? The partner, still outside, still capable of complicating everything if he thinks Dom's been neutralized. This was the moral weight of the moment settling onto her all at once, not the physical confrontation, which had resolved itself in seconds through instinct and training, but the decision now facing her in its aftermath. She could restrain Dom here, silently, and wait for police to breach the building through official channels, allowing the situation to resolve through proper protocol. Or she could use the radio, risk revealing far more about her own capabilities than she had ever intended to reveal to anyone in this hospital, and actively manage the threat still waiting outside before it escalated into something involving officers who had no idea what they were walking into. If I stay silent and he panics outside, he might do something that gets an officer killed. If I speak, I expose everything I've spent 9 years keeping hidden. It wasn't a comfortable choice. It had never been a comfortable choice, in any version of her life, in any corridor she'd ever stood in making decisions like this one. The version of herself she'd built in this hospital, quiet, careful, unremarkable, had a cost attached to preserving it, and that cost, in this exact moment, was measured in the safety of officers who would soon be moving through this building with incomplete information. She looked down at Dom, still sprawled against the concrete, watching her with wide, frightened eyes. Is there a second entry point your partner's covering? Tell me now, and I will make sure whatever happens to you next reflects that you cooperated. The loading dock, Dom said, voice cracking, all remaining defiance drained out of him. He's watching the loading dock, making sure nobody gets out that way before what? Before we're supposed to force a trade. Hostage for a car. That was the plan if it went bad. Elena absorbed this with the same cold, efficient clarity she absorbed every piece of tactical information, filing it into a rapidly forming picture of exactly how dangerous the next several minutes could still become if she made the wrong choice now. A second man, armed, watching an exit point, expecting a hostage exchange that's never going to happen. If police approach that loading dock without knowing this, someone could die who doesn't need to. She made her decision. Reaching down, she unclipped the radio from Dom's jacket, careful to keep the recovered pistol trained loosely in his direction, her ribs screaming with every small motion but her hands remaining, as always, steady. She pressed the transmit button. This is not Dom, she said, her voice transforming in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd worked beside her for the past 3 years. Flatter, harder, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with hospital rank or nursing credentials. Dom is restrained and no longer a threat. You need to stand down now, before this becomes something neither of you walks away from. Silence on the other end, followed by a burst of static, then a voice tight with disbelief. Who the hell is this? Someone who doesn't want anyone else getting hurt tonight, including you, Elena said. Police are already staging outside. Whatever plan you had died the moment Dom put that gun down. Your best option now is walking away from that loading dock before they find you there. Another pause, longer this time. You don't know who you're talking to, the voice said, though the bravado in it had thinned considerably. I know exactly what this looks like from where I'm standing, Elena said. A partner who's about to get arrested for armed robbery and hostage-taking, or a man who leaves right now and lives to make better decisions tomorrow. That's the whole choice. Make it fast. The radio went silent. No response. No confirmation. Elena didn't know, in that moment, whether he would run or stay, whether her words had carried the weight she needed them to carry, or whether this entire exchange had simply bought a few more minutes before an entirely different confrontation began somewhere else in the building. That uncertainty was its own kind of cost, the cost of choosing to act, to expose this fragment of herself, without any guarantee it would matter. She lowered the radio, breathing shallowly against the pain in her ribs, and looked down at Dom, who stared up at her with an expression that had moved past fear into something closer to bewildered defeat. "You're not a nurse," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elena didn't answer. Some truths weren't hers to hand out. Not to a man who'd stormed a hospital ward with a gun. Not to anyone, really, who hadn't earned the specific trust required to receive them. "Stay still," she said instead, and reached for the roll of medical tape at her waistband. Not a weapon this time, but the tool she'd originally taken it from the supply closet to use, binding his wrists with quick, practiced efficiency while her ribs protested every movement, and the distant sound of sirens grew steadily louder outside the building's walls. Somewhere above them, in the ward she'd left behind, Sarah and Marcus, in a room full of frightened patients, were still waiting for an ending they had no way of knowing was already, mostly, decided. Elena Cho sat back against the cold concrete wall beside a restrained gunman, pressed a hand gingerly against her ribs, and waited for the moment the world above would finally catch up to what had just happened beneath it. The silence that followed her radio transmission didn't last. Elena heard it first as a faint scrape against metal, somewhere back toward the loading dock end of the maintenance corridor. Footsteps, deliberate, unhurried in a way that suggested either confidence or reconnaissance rather than panic. Dom, still bound and slumped against the wall beside her, lifted his head at the sound, some flicker of hope crossing his face before Elena's glance silenced it. "He's not leaving," Dom said quietly. "No," Elena agreed. "He's coming to see for himself." She rose carefully, favoring her injured ribs, and moved Dom's pistol from her waistband into a two-handed grip she hadn't used in 9 years, but that her body remembered with unsettling ease. Sights aligned, weight balanced, breathing controlled into something slow, and even despite the pain radiating through her side. He'll come around the same blind turn Dom did. Same mistake, if he's not careful. She positioned herself against the corridor wall, angled so she'd have a clear view of the turn without being immediately visible to anyone approaching it, and waited. The footsteps grew closer, then paused. The particular pause of someone who'd noticed something wrong. A dropped radio transmission. An unnatural silence where gunfire echo should have produced chaos, not quiet. "Dom," a voice called out, low and wary. "Dom, you good?" Elena said nothing. Beside her, Dom opened his mouth, and she fixed him with a look sharp enough to close it again. The footsteps resumed, slower now, more cautious, and a shape edged around the corner. A second man, younger than Dom, unmasked, a pistol held in a two-handed grip that suggested at least some training, though not enough to prevent the mistake of leading with his shoulder before his eyes had fully cleared the corner. "Drop it," Elena said, her voice carrying the flat, absolute authority of someone who had given that exact command in circumstances far more dire than a hospital maintenance corridor. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The man's eyes went wide, first at the sight of Dom bound on the floor, then at the sight of a hospital nurse holding a pistol with a stance that clearly wasn't improvised. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated, weighing his own weapon against the certainty radiating from the person now aiming one back at him. "You shoot me," Elena said, "and you're not walking out of this building. Not past the police units already staging outside. Not past whatever's left of a plan that already fell apart the moment your partner got disarmed. Put it down." His arm trembled. Elena watched his finger, watched his shoulders, watched the specific micro-hesitations that told her he was searching for a way out that didn't exist, and slowly, painfully, arriving at the same conclusion she'd already reached for him. The pistol lowered, then dropped, clattering against the concrete. "On the ground, hands behind your back." He complied, lowering himself with the same defeated slowness Dom had shown earlier, and Elena moved forward to secure him with the remaining tape from her waistband, her ribs screaming with every motion, her breathing shallow but controlled. That was when the corridor's far door burst open. Police! Hands visible, everyone on the ground now. Elena's instincts, old, deep, immovable, recognized the entry technique even before her eyes fully registered the tactical unit flooding into the corridor, weapons raised, moving in the practice formation of officers trained for exactly this kind of breach. She dropped the pistol immediately, raised her hands, and lowered herself to her knees without hesitation, every motion deliberate and unmistakably compliant. Don't be a variable they have to solve for. Be the easiest person in this corridor to understand. 2 suspects secured. She called out clearly, keeping her voice calm and formative, stripped of anything that might read as a threat. Both restrained. I'm hospital staff. Weapon on the ground is theirs, not mine. The lead officer's eyes swept the scene. Dom and his partner both bound, both disarmed. A nurse kneeling calmly amid the wreckage of a hostage situation that should have taken a SWAT team to resolve. And something in his expression shifted from tactical assessment into open confusion. Ma'am, step back from the weapon and identify yourself. Elena Cho, night shift nurse, 10th floor. She said it exactly as she'd said it every day for the past 3 years. Flat and ordinary, though even she could hear how little that explanation covered. The officer's radio crackled, and a voice, sharper, more senior, cut through it. Copy that a suspect's down in the maintenance corridor. Who secured him? Unclear. The lead officer said, still watching Elena carefully. Civilians claiming she did. A pause. Then the senior voice again, this time slower, more deliberate. Get her name again. Cho. Elena Cho. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But Elena felt every one of them land with the particular weight of a door she'd kept firmly shut for 9 years, finally creaking open despite everything she'd done to keep it closed. Copy, the senior voice said finally, and something in his tone had changed entirely. No longer procedural, but careful, almost reverent. Everyone stand down. I need a supervisor on site immediately, and somebody find out if she's hurt. The lead officer frowned at his radio, then at Elena, clearly missing whatever context had just shifted his commanding officer's entire demeanor. Sir, just do it, the voice snapped. And nobody touches that woman's file. Nobody. Elena remained kneeling, hands still raised, ribs aching, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing the exact same unsteady rhythm it had when this entire night began. Around her, officers exchanged confused glances, radios crackling with instructions none of them fully understood. And for the first time since the ward doors had burst open nearly 40 minutes earlier, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what her body had just endured. She didn't know, not yet, who on that radio had recognized her name, or what exactly they intended to do with the knowledge. She only knew that whatever quiet, careful life she'd built in this hospital had just cracked open in a way she wouldn't be able to fully close again. Some part of her, old, tired, familiar, had known this moment would come eventually. She just hadn't expected it to arrive on a Tuesday in a maintenance corridor, with 2 bound men on the floor and her ribs throbbing with every breath. They let her stand eventually, though let wasn't quite the right word. The officers seemed unsure of the correct procedure for someone who had just single-handedly disarmed 2 armed suspects and was now the apparent subject of urgent, hushed conversations happening over radios she wasn't supposed to be able to hear clearly. She heard them anyway. Old habits. Said not to touch her file. That's all I know. Supervisor's 15 minutes out. Wants her kept on scene. Somebody get a paramedic. She's holding her ribs. A young paramedic named Diaz found her sitting on the edge of a gurney near the loading dock. The corridor behind her now flooded with police tape and hushed activity. He checked her ribs with careful, professional hands, pressing gently along the bruised area until she winced. Nothing feels broken, but you need imaging to be sure, he said. 2, maybe 3 bruised or hairline fractured ribs. You should have said something sooner. I was busy, Elena said, and Diaz laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, before catching himself and returning to a more professional demeanor. Right. Of course. Word had already begun moving through the hospital staff in the particular, unstoppable way that word moves through hospitals. Fragmented, exaggerated in places, but carrying an undeniable core of truth that made everyone who heard it look at Elena Cho a little differently than they had 12 hours earlier. Sarah found her first, pushing past a police officer's half-hearted attempt to maintain a perimeter, her face streaked with dried tears and something that looked almost like awe. "You're okay," Sarah said, voice cracking. They said you took both of them down. By yourself." "Is that I had help?" Elena said. The panic button Marcus pressed. The response time. It wasn't just me. It was, in fact, mostly her, and both of them seemed to understand that even as Elena deflected it with the same practiced ease she'd used to deflect Dr. Whitfield's questions months earlier. Sarah didn't push further. She simply reached out, hesitant, and hugged her, careful of the ribs, gentle in a way that suggested she'd already heard about the injury from someone else's version of the story. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "You did fine," Elena said. "You stayed calm when it mattered." It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it, but it was the kind of gentle untruth that let people walk away from terrifying nights with something to hold on to besides fear. Dr. Whitfield arrived 20 minutes later, having been pulled from an unrelated surgery once word reached that his ward had been the site of an armed hostage situation. He found Elena still seated on the gurney, ribs taped, an oxygen monitor clipped absently to her finger despite her insistence that she didn't need it. He didn't ask the question everyone else seemed too afraid to ask directly. He simply looked at her for a long moment, the way he had months earlier during the pileup, recalculating something in real time. "You've done this before," he said finally. Not a question again, an observation, the same one he'd made once before, except this time carrying the full weight of everything that had happened since. "Everyone's done. Don't," he said gently, cutting her off without heat. "Not tonight. You don't have to tell me anything. I just want you to know I'm not going to pretend I believe the version where you got lucky." Elena said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. The hospital's administrator arrived next, along with a man in a plain gray suit who introduced himself only as with the bureau and asked to speak with Elena privately, in an empty consultation room down the hall. Dr. Whitfield walked her there himself, one hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching it, the way people do when they're unsure whether someone needs support or would rather refuse it. The man in the gray suit closed the door behind them and studied Elena for a long moment before speaking. "Sergeant First Class Cho," he said quietly. "Retired. Ranger Regiment. 9 years." Elena's expression didn't change, though something in her posture straightened almost imperceptibly. Old muscle memory responding to a name and rank spoken aloud for the first time in years within these walls. "That information isn't supposed to be accessible," she said. "It isn't, which is exactly why I need to understand how two low-level criminals with a half-formed embezzlement scheme happen to walk into a hospital ward where the one person capable of neutralizing them without a single serious injury just happened to be working the night shift." He studied her carefully. "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here because someone upstairs wants to know if your specific skill set is being wasted stocking supply carts." "It's not being wasted," Elena said evenly. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He didn't push, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer, the particular look of someone recognizing a decision he disagreed with but respected too much to argue against. "For what it's worth," he said, standing to leave, "the man on the radio tonight, the one who recognized your name, served under a commanding officer who served under you 3 deployments back. Small world, apparently, even in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning." He left without further explanation, and Elena sat alone in the consultation room for a long moment, absorbing the strange, quiet vertigo of a past she'd buried carefully resurfacing through channels entirely outside her control. By 6 a.m., as the sun began edging pale light through the hospital's east-facing windows, the scene had mostly cleared. Dom and his partner were in custody. The loading dock reopened. The ward's patients, including Mrs. Alvarez, shaken but unharmed, settling back into whatever rest the night had left them capable of. Elena stood near the nurse's station, ribs taped, exhaustion settling into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the particular weight of having been seen, however briefly, as something other than the quiet, unremarkable nurse she'd spent 3 years carefully constructing. Marcus approached hesitantly, holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee, offering one to her without quite meeting her eyes. "I don't really know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything. I called you slow once, back in my first month. I told Sarah you were too cautious to be a good ER nurse." Elena accepted the coffee, tasting the same lukewarm, forgettable liquid she'd been drinking for years. "You weren't wrong that I'm cautious. I was wrong about everything else." She didn't answer that directly. Some conclusions were better left for people to reach on their own, at their own pace, without her confirming or denying anything that would only complicate a life she still intended to keep quiet, ordinary, and entirely her own. 3 nights later, the ward had returned almost entirely to its ordinary rhythm. The visitor logs were fastidiously checked now, a small procedural change nobody had explicitly announced, but everyone quietly observed. Ray, still working overnight security, had taken to actually reviewing the side entrance camera feed instead of merely glancing at it, a habit shift Elena noticed without comment. Mrs. Alvarez had been moved to a different room, closer to the nurse's station, at her own request, and was recovering well, though she'd grown quieter, more watchful, in the specific way people do after discovering how thin the walls of safety actually are. Elena's ribs still ached beneath her scrubs, a dull, persistent reminder she'd learned to move around rather than through, but she'd refused any additional time off beyond the 2 mandatory days the hospital insisted on. Stillness, she'd found over the years, was harder to sit inside than motion. Charts, medication rounds, the low hum of monitors. These were easier to hold than the silence of an empty apartment and a mind that replayed corridors long after the corridors themselves had gone quiet. She checked on Mr. Alvarez in room 12. No relation to the widow down the hall, just a coincidence of surnames the staff still joked about tiredly. Adjusting his 4 with the same steady hands she'd always had, the same hands that had, 3 nights ago, disarmed 2 men in a maintenance corridor without anyone in this ward fully understanding how. "You're limping a little," he observed, watching her over his reading glasses. "Long week," she said. "I heard about the long week." His eyes held hers a moment, something knowing in them despite his age, despite the haze of pain medication still working through his system. "Whatever you did, thank you. This ward would have been a very different place without it." Elena adjusted his blanket, saying nothing, and he seemed to understand that her silence was its own kind of answer. Not modesty exactly, but something closer to a boundary she needed kept, and he respected it enough not to press further. At the nurse's station, Dr. Whitfield reviewed a chart without looking up as she passed. "The hospital board wants to give you some kind of formal recognition. A ceremony, maybe a plaque that I'd rather they didn't that I told them you'd say that." He finally glanced up, something almost amused in his tired expression. "They're going to do it anyway, probably. Boards like ceremonies. Makes them feel useful. Then I'll be conveniently unavailable that day that I figured." He returned to his chart, then added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, nobody's asking you to explain anything. Whatever you did before this, whoever you were, it's not going to change how people here see you. Not the important people, anyway." "It already has," Elena said quietly. "Just not in the way they think." He didn't ask her to elaborate, and she didn't offer to. Some truths were meant to live in the space between people rather than in the words exchanged directly, and Elena had made peace a long time ago with letting most of her truths live exactly there. Sarah found her near the medication room during the final hour of the shift, holding 2 cups of coffee this time instead of 1, offering the second without needing to be asked. "I looked something up," Sarah said carefully, "about Army Rangers, about selection rates for women, especially back when you would have." "Sarah, I'm not asking you to confirm anything," Sarah said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that whatever you were, whatever you are, it doesn't scare me. I just wanted to say thank you, and I wanted you to know I see you. Actually see you. Not just the quiet nurse everyone underestimated for 3 years." Elena accepted the coffee, considering the younger woman for a long moment. "The quiet nurse wasn't a lie, Sarah. It's who I chose to be. This," she gestured vaguely toward the ward, the hospital, the life she'd built brick by careful brick over 3 years. "This is real too. Maybe more real than anything that came before it." Even after everything you did that night, especially after everything I did that night. Elena's voice softened, though it lost none of its certainty. I didn't do it because some part of me missed being a soldier. I did it because people I care about were in danger, and I happened to have the tools to help. That's not a different life resurfacing. That's just using what I have when it's needed. Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing this with the particular seriousness of someone young enough to still be forming their understanding of what courage actually looked like. And Elena found herself hoping, quietly, that whatever lesson Sarah took from this night would serve her well long after the specific details had faded into hospital legend. At the end of the shift, as dawn's pale light crept across the ward's east-facing windows, Elena gathered her things from her locker. An ordinary bag, an ordinary jacket, the ordinary accessories of an ordinary life she had chosen, deliberately and completely, over the extraordinary one that had once defined her. She paused at the ward's entrance before leaving, glancing back at the familiar rhythm of morning shift change. Nurses exchanging updates, monitors beeping their steady chorus, the particular, unglamorous choreography of a hospital continuing to function exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would, regardless of what had happened within its walls 3 nights earlier. Nobody looked at her differently as she walked out. Nobody stopped her for photographs or statements, or the kind of recognition the hospital board seemed so eager to bestow. The story had already begun fading into the specific, forgiving blur that hospital stories eventually became, remembered vividly by those who'd lived it, softened into rumor for everyone else, until eventually it would simply become another piece of the ward's unspoken history, filed away alongside every other crisis these walls had weathered. That was exactly how Elena wanted it. She stepped out into the cool morning air, breathing it in slowly, carefully, mindful of her still healing ribs, and began the familiar walk toward the parking structure. An unremarkable woman in ordinary clothes, disappearing into an ordinary morning, exactly the way she'd learned, a long time ago, that the quietest strength was often the kind nobody ever needed to see. Behind her, the hospital continued its steady, indifferent hum, already moving on to whatever the next shift would bring. She didn't look back.